Greetings and welcome to the exciting conclusion, hopefully, of Chapter 8. Now, in the first half of Chapter 8, we were talking about doing a t-test with related samples, where we were doing a within groups design where you have a subject and we compare, the subject off the medication to the subject on the medication, the same subject, or matched groups, or two halves of a couple, or in some ways groups that were related to one another. So we're still doing difference of means here. It's the same sort of deal, except in this case, we're doing independent samples, where in this case, they're not related to one another. They're completely different. And this is going to change how we do the t-test, because a lot of things that we could assume were the same or were similar in the first half of the chapter are now not. So I do want to warn you that the formulas here are going to look scary, but sit and break it down. You know exactly what goes into each one of these formulas. Just don't look at it as a whole. Look at it as a conglomeration of things we've already done. Remember, statistics, everything builds on what came before. So we have two independent samples. This is what we generally think of when we think of doing research. It's either between subjects, or it's sometimes called between groups, where instead of, say, in the first case, where with the related samples, where you have people serve as their own controls, we measure how depressed people behave, and then we compare how they behave when they're on their medication, and that's our matched pair. Here, what we do is what people tend to think of happens in research anyway, where we have two groups, each selected independently, each selected randomly. One group is given the experimental treatment, the drug in this case, the other group is not, and the results from both groups are compared to one another. So it's independent samples. Now, one thing that has not changed is the null hypothesis, because in the same way as with the related groups, the null hypothesis says there is no difference between the means of the two groups. That's what we're assuming. That's what we're checking to see whether or not it's actually true. However, it does tend to get a bit complicated from here on out, simply because we're not talking essentially about the same group. Within groups, we're talking about the same group, one group, okay, because they're paired. So we're assuming that they more or less come from the same group, that the group as a whole would have one mean and one variance and one standard deviation. What we're talking about here is individual scores, individual people, groups that are completely different from one another. So unlike with two dependent samples, or when we're comparing a sample to the population mean, which is what we've done before with the t-tests, back at the beginning of Chapter 8 and also in Chapter 7, and here what we're doing is we're dealing with two distributions. The distribution of the first group and the distribution of the second group, which are not going to be identical, and indeed we may even have different sample sizes. Remember, with in the first half of the chapter, n was essentially the number of people in one group, because that was exactly the same as the number of people in the second. They were related pairs. Here they are not. So we have the n for the first group and the n for the second group. And what this means is that we can't sort of start someplace that we already know. We can't use the standard deviation, for instance, that we've already known. We can't use a lot of the formulas that came before. We got to start in many ways from scratch. So instead of starting with the standard deviation, we need to start with the variance. We need to find the variance, and therefore from that, it will give us the standard deviation. But quite frankly, since we gotta find the variance to find the standard deviation anyway, this hopefully won't be too incredibly difficult, except for the fact that the equation that we're going to be using to find the standard deviation of these independent groups is a trifle frightening at first glance. So I'm just warning you to you might want to take a deep breath before we move on, okay? Because there it is. Okay, you take that deep breath. So, but you'll notice that if you look at the formula, and this formula is a little bit different from the formula in your book. I got this from a different source, mostly because I didn't want to try to recreate this particular formula using PowerPoint's not very strong equation editor. So what we have here is we have the standard deviation of basically the difference between the two means. The difference between the two means of your first group of samples and the means of second group of samples is equivalent to the square root of n1, that is the number in the first group, minus 1, quantity multiplied by the variance of the first group. And how you find the variance, of course, of the first group is, we went through that in past chapters. You can find the variance of an individual group. The problem, of course, is then you need to, a lot of times, let's just say this will be given to you in the hopes of saving time. So we add that first to the number of the second group, the number of samples in the second group, group 2 minus 1, multiplied by the variance of the second group, all of which is divided by the number in the first group, n1, and the number in the second group, n2, minus 2. Now, the minus 2 makes sense if you think about it, because how do you find, what would we do in order to find the standard deviation of the first group? It would be n minus 1, right? So we have n minus 1 plus n minus 1 plus n minus 2, which is essentially n plus n minus 2. And we're multiplying that by 1 over n1 plus 1 over n2. Now, your book has it all under the same, basically, it's all under the same square root. But in this one, it's separate. If you want to change it so it's all under the same, like your book, you certainly can. But the one thing I want to remind you before you hyperventilate is you've seen all of these before. You literally have seen all of these before. None of this is new. The n isn't new. The variance isn't new. The s squared isn't new. Now, we've got the little sub numbers there that are new. However, that just tells you where they came from. Okay? Everything else in here should be something that you can do, something that we have done. And quite frankly, the t-text formula is very similar as well, because we're basically looking at the difference between the mean of the first group of scores, plus the mean of the second group of scores, minus 0, because we're assuming, remember, it's the same thing, central limit theorem, we're assuming that the difference between the means is 0, okay? The difference between the sampling distribution of the mean differences, yeah, trust me, it's 0, okay? Over the standard deviation that you just figured out. Okay? So, in actuality, it's very, very similar. In actuality, actually, I take that back. It's not standard deviation, it's standard error. I do apologize, but as long as you follow the formula, you'll be fine. Okay? So, there's your formula. Okay? That's how you find the formula. There's the formula. The degrees of freedom are essentially what we're dividing by to get that standard error. They're n1 plus n2 minus 2. Okay? Make sure that you take a moment to write these down if you haven't already. It'll probably make more sense than my descriptions have been. Okay. Now, how difficult these are depend a lot on how much information that you get on the test. I haven't decided yet, because as you could probably figure, if I ask you to start from scratch and give you a group of numbers for each group and ask you to actually find the variance and then find the standard deviation and go through everything, that could take up half your test time. So the odds are that I'm going to just kind of assume that you understand how to find the standard deviation, how to find the variance, because we already did that. Okay? We already did that. We did that a couple of chapters ago, back when the world was normal and we weren't all sitting at home staring at our computers. Okay? So I'm going to kind of assume that you know that. So I'm going to give you an example of the sort of question that you might be seeing on the test. And basically what this is I'm going to give you most of this information. You just need to find the right formula to put it in. So we're assuming 2 independent samples in the following information. Of course, it'll probably be a word problem when I actually do it, but work with me. The mean of the group 1 is this. Now, you cannot assume that I'm always going to tell you that the mean of group 1 is x bar sub 1. Okay, I got to test you on something. So I may give you a word problem, and you're going to have to pick these out of the word problem. Okay? So I'll try to find some examples of this and put them up as a practice problem, where you're going to have to find them, because I'm not sure that your book does this. I'm not sure that your book in the chapters that it does this for. I think they have a tendency to just sort of give you the numbers and ask you to plug them in. Nope, I lied. They actually are word problems. So the problems that you're going to be getting on the test are going to look a lot like the word problems at the back of the chapter, which means they're not going to be this obvious. Make sure you definitely do those problems. But if I give you all of these, then what you simply need to do is calculate t, assuming a 0.05 level of significance. Alpha equals 0.05. Do you reject or fail to reject? Now, what you're going to need to do with the word problems is simply sit and write all these down. So I want you, hopefully you can see the cursor, I want you to not press that button. I want you to write all these down in the show your work. Just like this. I want you to write them all down just like this in the show your work. Everything under 1, okay? Because that way I know that you got the right answer. Again, for partial credit, I'm going to be looking at the show your work. So get all those from the word problems. And the answer then, I hate to say simply, but the answer at this point is pretty much just find the formulas you need to use. Here they are. Okay. Plug in the numbers. Plug in the numbers. This is what you're going to find. Okay, when you work them out. The critical value, once you get the degree of freedom at 0.05, with the degree of freedom of 26, which is 11 plus 17 minus 2, is 2.055. Now, your critical value is more extreme than your t, which means that we're going to fail to reject the null hypothesis. Remember, if your t-score is more extreme, is larger on either end than the critical value, then we will reject the null. But in this case, it's smaller, so we fail to reject. A lot of what these problems are going to be, since I am giving you the formulas, you don't have to memorize them. You do have to recognize them. So a lot of this is going to be practicing picking information out of word problems. Okay, and writing them down the way that I suggested. Writing them down, let me back up for a second, writing them down like this, because once you have this, once you know what all these numbers are, this part is just plugging numbers in. It's just plugging numbers in. Okay, it's kind of cookbooky. I hate to say that stats is a cookbook, but sometimes it is. So once you get these done, all you have to do is plug in the numbers. Once you plug in the numbers, showing all of your work, show me what you have. Send your work to me after you upload the test, and there's a fairly good chance that even if you miss problems on the test, like I said, that you may be getting partial credit for some of the ones that you missed. Unfortunately, Blackboard testing doesn't understand partial credit. So do not take your score that Blackboard gives you as your final score. That is the lowest score you will get, but it's not your final, because I'm going to go through and look at all of these. Okay? I'm going to go through and look at them. So with that, we are done with Chapter 8. The test for Chapter 8. Chapter 7 and 8, you have to finish it by 6 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time on April 1st. The test should be up by March 28th, and you will have that entire period to get it done. If you have questions, please ask me during office hours, which are being held on Skype during our normal class times.